Kia ora katoa. Thank you, Helen, for the invitation, and thank you to my wife, Pat, with whom I bounced a few ideas in that secular labyrinth, otherwise called St. Luke's Mall, yesterday. So some thoughts around the theme of flowing from Lent towards Easter. This last Wednesday, if any of you might have missed it, was World Water Day. Since 1993, this day has recognised the importance of universal access to clean water in developing countries, as well as the more general sustainable management of freshwater resources everywhere. Perhaps that day needs greater recognition. It's therefore timely, perhaps, to ask, what is the place of water in our prayer, our relationships, our being in the world? For me, when I reflect on that question, there's no experience more sacred and prayerful than when I'm in the mountains, pack on my back, when I descend upon my hands and knees, thirsty, and cup to my mouth handfuls of water from a stream, clean, filtered by roots and moss. So along with air, water is self-evidently, perhaps, a critical requirement of sustaining life. It's a banal statement, maybe, but without water, all creatures eventually suffer and die. In short, water is a fundamental physiological need. And so the simple act of giving water to the thirsty, whether they be people, animals, or plants, is an act of mercy. And notwithstanding the recent floods we've had in Auckland, these are changing times in terms of planetary thirst, when drought is at the door of many, when the presence and the purity of water is under threat. In these times, we are surely called to reflect on the significance of water flowing not just through our planet, but also through our lives. Beyond sustaining our bodies and the bodies of other sentient beings, water fulfills higher order purposes in our human lives. It has cleansing properties, washing away dirt and bodily wastes. It meets our social needs, encouraging playfulness. Watch families at a beach. Water also appeals to our sense of beauty. Consider fountains and waterfalls. So according to psychologist Abraham Maslow, water meets a complete hierarchy of our needs in our lives, from the basic physiological of thirst right up to what he calls self-actualization, that affirmation of identity that comes from seeing water as beauty. For us on our faith journeys, water is also deeply sacramental and symbolic. We can add that to Maslow's hierarchy, perhaps. Yet, if our experience of water in our everyday lives becomes compromised, polluted, can it retain a sacred place in our lives? I think that is a question we need to ponder. On the shores of Lake Erie in Canada in the mid-1980s, I had the opportunity of being as part of a collective dialogue with Thomas Berry, who, rather than a theologian, calls himself a geologian. He pointed to the murky waters, saying, if we allow waterways to become polluted, our understanding of baptism itself becomes degraded. I found that a very challenging statement to reflect on. Berry was saying that if the power of the symbol has any integrity, then it needs to be sustained by the integrity of its elements. If we are surrounded by impure, if not dangerous water, then maybe baptism loses some of its meaning. So offering water to the thirsty that comes from the imperative of baptism is but the beginning of mercy. In the rest of my comments, I want to suggest that if we are Christians, we also need to act in the defense of the quality of water. 3 images in the media have recently spoken to me of the fragile sense of fresh water in New Zealand. First, images of herds of cattle straying into lakes and rivers, defecating into lakes and rivers. Farming has long been our country's sacred cow. It has been the source of our collective wealth, yes. But the problem is that to question its practices can sometimes be seen as tantamount to treason. Yet public opinion is turning. We can surely no longer go with the flow and accept farming as priority over national water quality. Second image. Consents have been granted for the extraction and export of billions of litres of artesian water. That this water is bottled and exported has added to the sense of national outrage. But are multinational corporations extracting and bottling water any more morally questionable than large-scale irrigation for dairying in otherwise arid parts of our country? Third image, very recent, only saw it on social media yesterday. Forest and Bird, to which we belong, just received a donation of $5 million from a couple wanting to strengthen the organisation's commitment to defending freshwater in Aotearoa. In other recent activism, students marched on Wellington presenting a petition calling for all freshwater in New Zealand to be swimmable. It's important to have ideals. If polluting waterways is a sin of commission, then surely failing to appreciate the essential value of water is a sin of omission in these morally arid times. Our government is proposing wadeable and boatable as water quality bottom lines. Do we really want rivers that are only safe to wade in? What about to swim in, to play in, to gather watercress from? Boatable? What about potable? Drinkable? Let's lift the bar and promote the contention that our waterways must support an acceptable standard of ecological health and meet a range of human needs. One problem, it seems to me, is that a regional approach to freshwater management sees large slabs of our political landscape in charge of water policy. What about the local? One of Thomas Berry's enduring concerns was a bioregional consciousness, bringing not just our thinking but our passion down to the level of the water catchment. Have we lost a love for our local waterways? That's a question we might consider as dwellers of this city. A useful exercise at this time might therefore be to think about the water within your local catchment. Do you know the boundaries of your local water catchment? Where does rainfall flow to within your neighbourhood? Where is your closest stream? Where does it ultimately exit to the sea? What life does it support? How can we support its health? We need to challenge ourselves to take a fresh approach to water, to reappreciate the blessing that it is, to feel it, to maybe even taste it anew. Perhaps we might walk outside without an umbrella in the next shower of rain, as if a drought has broken, as if our body and our being had forgotten the blessing of being wet. As we approach Good Friday, we recall that on the cross, Jesus said, "I thirst." Two simple words, "I thirst." Most literally, to thirst is to feel the body crying out to be quenched and to maintain life. But at a metaphorical level, and we've heard many water metaphors in the service already this morning, to thirst is also to yearn for something that is seemingly unattainable. We thirst for justice, we thirst for community, we thirst for acceptance, and we thirst for God. The psalmist sings, "My soul thirsts for thee, as in a dry and weary land where no water is." That is metaphor at its most powerful. It is time we also had a thirst for purer waters. In his soulful song of water crisis, the contemporary psalmist, my tongue's a little in cheek, but the contemporary psalmist Dave Dobbin, who lives in this city, sings, "Where you going to be when the river don't run no more? Who are you going to run to when the desert's at your door, when there isn't any more?" We tend to have a taken for granted presumption that water will flow when we need it. We have a taken for granted presumption that water is on tap for daily needs. What should we thirst for? Surely we should thirst for a land in which rivers flow clean, so the intrinsic value of life is upheld. To lose that thirst is to lose our passion for a just and merciful world, a world in which, as Thomas Berry said, the water of baptism is a potent and pure symbol. If we and the generations that follow us fail to know waters distinguished by clarity, purity, liveliness, baptism itself will be reduced to a token symbol dispensed from the same plastic containers that are filled and exported by corporations from our springs. As a footnote, I had the opportunity last month to spend some time in the nation, the Maldives, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and there, from a distance, every island looks like the perfect image of a tropical island, and yet when you get there, the beaches are just littered. There would have been a dozen plastic bottles in every square metre washed up. I want to close by saying that in the last week there has been a note of hope, and that is important. As we journey towards Easter, indications of hope are so important. That hope, to me at least, is that the Whanganui River has become the world's first waterway to be granted the legal status of a person. Some will see that as crazy, mad. A city as a river as a person. Perhaps, however, this is prophetic. Indeed, I saw that India very quickly is moving towards the Ganges being given the same legal status. It seems to me that granting the river legal status is a route out of dualism. It offers a third way. It's perhaps an example of what mystic Cynthia Bourgeault calls a Trinitarian metaphysics. The move acknowledges that the life force of the river that runs through all of us will flow on even after we are gone. It gets beyond all the contemporary dualisms of Māori Pākehā, yours, mine, resource or sacred. It suggests that the river has wairua, spirit. It speaks to three persons and yet one life, like the Trinity, you, me, the river. So take a walk along your own river. My river is Oakley Creek, across towards the west from here. Treat the river as having personhood as you walk beside it. See how that feels. In Ivan Illich's book, H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness, he writes of the paradox of water that is both a domestic necessity and a spiritual force. And that, to me, is the tension that we live with. In so many ways, we've lost the sacred. For instance, we talk about housing as a tradable currency. And in so doing, we lose the sense of dwelling, the sacred sense of dwelling somewhere. So too, perhaps, in speaking of water as a resource, we lose some of its sacredness. So water has historically moved from a spiritual purity to H2O, a scientifically purified form of water that comes through our taps. It comes through our taps necessarily purified, but so purified that we want to buy bottles of more purified water that doesn't have the chemicals in that comes through our taps. How about that for a contradiction? So to close, 2 Sundays ago, we experienced a different sort of water day, an Auckland water day like we haven't seen before, at least I haven't. In the wake of months' worth of rain falling in 2 days, our local creek, Te Aonga, Oakley Creek, was a raging torrent. And then later in that day, we were asked to save water, to save on water consumption. What a paradox. For a time, it seemed as if there was water everywhere, but too little clean enough to drink. We live with these paradoxes and contradictions as we journey. As James K. Baxter writes in Autumn Testament, the creek has to run muddy before it can run clear. We too must embrace the murkiness of Lenten questions before we reach the clarity of Easter waters.